The rain didn't just fall. It hammered against the White Moon Palace's skeletal ribs like a dying giant's pulse. High on the unfinished roof, the wind tore at Edith Penhaligon's hair, whipping strands across her face as she watched the man before her. Frederick St. Clare, the Duke of Ashbourne, stood at the abyss's edge, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the lightning-streaked sky. In his hands, a thick roll of vellum, the master plans for the Empire's grandest ballroom fed, sheet by sheet, into a rusted iron brazier. The flames roared, hungry and bright, consuming years of Edith's life in seconds. "Stop. Your Grace, please." Edith lunged, her boots slipping on the slick stone. She didn't think of the heat. She only saw the lines of ink, the arches, the vaulted ceilings, the building's soul curling into black ash. She thrust her bare hand toward the fire's rim, catching the corner of the last blueprint just as the Duke let it go. Frederick didn't move to help her. He stood like a statue of salt, his eyes cold, vacant, and terrifyingly dark. "Let it burn, Miss Penhaligon," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp that cut through the thunder. "It's a monument to a lie, a tomb for a fool. Tomorrow, the demolition crews arrive. I want this place leveled before the sun sets." Edith clutched the singed paper to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You can destroy the stone, but you cannot burn the truth of what we built," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury and exhaustion. This wasn't just for her. It was for the world. The Duke turned, firelight catching the sharp, hollowed angles of his face. "There is no world left," he whispered. "Only the ruins." The carriage ride back to the temporary estate office was silent, save for the rhythmic splashing of hooves in the mud. Frederick sat across from Edith, his gaze fixed out the window at the dark Ashbourne moors. He had once commanded legions, a war hero whispered with awe in the capital. Now, he looked like a ghost inhabiting a suit of fine wool. The news had broken a week ago. Lady Gwendalyn, the woman for whom the White Moon Palace was being built, had not only broken her engagement to Frederick, but had fled the country with a significant portion of his liquid assets, seeking refuge with his greatest political rival. The betrayal was surgical. It was designed not just to leave him poorer, but to leave him a laughingstock. Edith looked down at her hands. Her fingertips were soot-stained and blistered from the brazier. To the world, she was merely the daughter of the late, great architect Silas Penhaligon, a woman allowed into the guild only because of her father's lingering influence. To Frederick, she was a contractor. But to Edith, the palace was her first and perhaps only chance to prove that a woman could hold the sky up with stone and mortar. "I will not sign the demolition orders," Edith said quietly, breaking the silence. Frederick didn't turn his head. "You are an employee, Miss Penhaligon. You will do as you are told." "I am the lead architect," she corrected him, her voice gaining strength. "Under our contract, the structural integrity and site finalization are under my jurisdiction until the building is deemed uninhabitable by a neutral magistrate. It is not a ruin yet, Your Grace. It is a masterpiece in mourning." Frederick finally looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, the bitterness there so thick it was almost tangible. "A masterpiece? It is a cage. Every window was designed to catch the light she liked. Every hallway was measured to the length of her stride. I cannot breathe in that place. It smells of her perfume and my own stupidity." "Then change the air," Edith countered. She leaned forward, the singed blueprint still held tightly in her lap. "You built this for a ghost. Build it now for the living. Give me 3 months. Move into the south wing. It's the only part with a finished roof and a working hearth. Live there. If, after 90 days, the stones still scream her name, I will set the charges myself." The Duke let out a short, mirthless laugh. "You would wager your career on my ability to forget? I wager it on the building's ability to heal," she said softly. "Architecture isn't just about walls, Your Grace. It's about how we move through the world. Let me show you a different way to move." The south wing was a skeleton of its intended glory, but it was sturdy. While the rest of the palace remained a labyrinth of scaffolding and raw stone, Edith spent the first 48 hours after their agreement transforming 3 small rooms into a sanctuary. She didn't use silk. She didn't use gold leaf. When Frederick arrived on the 3rd evening, driven by grim curiosity and a lack of anywhere else to go, he found the air smelling not of French lilies, but of cedarwood and beeswax. He stepped into the small study Edith had prepared. A fire crackled in a hearth made of rough-hewn local granite. A single high-backed armchair of dark oak sat before it, draped in a heavy wool throw. On a small side table, a bottle of amber brandy stood next to a stack of books, not architectural ledgers, but histories of the Moors and old poetry. Edith was standing by the window, marking a piece of stone with a chisel. She looked up, her face smudged with dust. "The master bedroom is still damp," she said, her tone professional. "But this room holds the heat well. I've had the workmen seal the drafts in the ceiling." Frederick walked to the center of the room, his boots echoing on the bare floorboards. He looked at the fire, then at the simple, sturdy furniture. It was a far cry from the opulent, suffocating luxury Gwendolyn had demanded. "It's small," he remarked, though the edge was gone from his voice. "It's honest," Edith replied. "A house should start with a fire and a place to sit. The rest is just theater." She walked toward the door, leaving him to the silence. As she reached the threshold, she paused. "The kitchen will have hot stew in an hour. One of the stonecutter's wives is cooking. It's not a banquet, Your Grace, but it's warm." Frederick didn't answer, but as the door clicked shut, he found himself sinking into the oak chair. For the first time in months, the sound of the wind outside didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a boundary. The weeks that followed were a grueling test of will. The palace was a chaotic symphony of hammers and saws, but the Duke remained a recluse in the south wing. He was a shadow that occasionally drifted through the construction site, his presence causing the workmen to fall silent. Edith watched him from the scaffolding. She saw the way he stared at the empty arches of the great hall, his hands clenched at his sides. He was waiting for the pain to sharpen, waiting for the moment he could tell her she had failed. But Edith was changing the script. She redirected the budget. The elaborate marble statues commissioned for the gardens were cancelled. Instead, she brought in tons of local slate and timber. She stopped the work on the grand ballroom entirely, focusing instead on the library and the communal spaces. One afternoon, a freak early frost turned the site into a death trap. A heavy crate of floor tiles, slick with ice, began to slide from a hoist directly above where a young apprentice was working. "Watch out!" Edith's scream was lost in the wind. The crate tipped, but before it could fall, a blur of movement crossed the muddy yard. Frederick, who had been standing near the west portico, lunged forward. He didn't just shout. He threw his weight against a support beam, redirecting the crane's swing. The crate smashed into a stone pillar instead of the boy, shattering into 1,000 ceramic shards. Frederick stood there, chest heaving, his expensive overcoat ruined by grease and grit. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from the sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. Edith scrambled down the ladder, reaching him just as the workmen gathered around. "Your Grace, are you hurt?" He looked at his hands, then at the terrified boy, and finally at Edith. For a moment, the cold mask of the Duke of Ashbourne slipped. There was a spark in his eyes, a flicker of the commander he used to be. "The hoist was improperly greased," he said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "And the weight distribution was off. Miss Penhaligon, see to it that the equipment is inspected before work resumes." "Yes, Your Grace," she breathed, her heart racing for a different reason now. He didn't retreat to his room immediately. He stayed, watching as they cleared the debris. He didn't offer a kind word, he wasn't that man yet, but he stayed in the cold, among the people who were building his future, until the last shard was swept away. That night, the Duke did not return to his solitude. Instead, he appeared in the makeshift drafting room Edith had established in the South Wing's gallery. The room was cold, lit only by a cluster of beeswax candles that cast long, flickering shadows across the vast rolls of parchment spread over a trestle table. Edith was hunched over a drawing of the library's central hearth, her fingers stained with graphite. She didn't hear him enter until his shadow fell across her work. She startled, her pencil skidding across the page. "The boy," Frederick said, his voice startlingly close. "Is he well?" Edith exhaled, her hand flying to her chest. "Shaken, Your Grace. But his father says he's already asking if he can come back to work tomorrow. They need the wages." Frederick moved closer, his eyes tracing the intricate lines of her drawing. He looked different without his formal coat. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with the muscle of a man who had once spent years in the saddle and on the field. "You've changed the design of the library," he noted, his finger hovering over the sketch of a hidden alcove. "Gwendolyn wanted floor-to-ceiling mirrors here, to reflect the light from the chandeliers. Mirrors make a room feel larger, but they also make it feel empty," Edith said softly, watching his face. "I thought a man who spent his winters in the mountains might prefer a space that holds the heat. Books provide better insulation than glass, and an alcove provides a place to disappear." Frederick's gaze shifted from the paper to her. The bitterness was still there, like a layer of frost, but beneath it was a flicker of something else: curiosity. "You study me, as if I were a site for a foundation, Miss Penhaligon. I study the inhabitant, Your Grace. A house is a garment. If it doesn't fit the person wearing it, it's just a costume." He reached out, his hand hesitating before he picked up a small carved piece of oak, a sample for the library's molding. He turned it over in his calloused palm. She never liked the smell of wood. She wanted everything gilded, everything bright enough to hide the shadows. "Shadows aren't something to be hidden," Edith replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "They're where we rest." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a clock. Frederick looked at the wood in his hand, then laid it back down with a gentleness that surprised her. "The drainage on the east side," he said, his tone shifting back to the practical. "The frost is going to turn to mud by morning. If the trenches aren't reinforced, the library's foundation will shift. I've seen it happen to fortifications in the north." Edith frowned, looking at her charts. "I have the men scheduled to reinforce them on Monday." "Monday will be too late," Frederick said. "The thaw starts at midnight." The Duke was right. By midnight, the temperature had climbed, and the frozen earth began to weep. The gentle patter of rain turned into a steady, relentless soak, turning the construction site into a treacherous mire. Edith was woken by a frantic knocking on her door. It was the night watchman, shouting about the East Trench. By the time she reached the site, wrapped in a heavy cloak and carrying a lantern, she found a scene of controlled chaos, and at the center of it was Frederick. He was knee-deep in the freezing mud, his white shirt translucent from the rain, barking orders to a handful of workmen who had been roused from their sleep. They were hauling heavy timber beams toward the sagging edge of the library's foundation. "Your Grace, get out of there," Edith cried, running toward the edge of the pit. "Grab the winch," he shouted back, ignoring her. "The shoring is giving way." Edith didn't hesitate. She dropped her lantern and grabbed the mud-slicked rope of the manual winch, digging her boots into the sludge. She felt the raw power of the earth pulling back, a terrifying weight that threatened to drag them all into the dark. Beside her, Frederick's hand slammed onto the rope, his palm overlapping hers. His skin was ice cold, but his grip was like iron. Together, they pulled. The muscles in his back bunched and strained under the wet fabric of his shirt. Edith could feel the heat radiating from him despite the freezing rain. A desperate, vital energy. "On my count," he roared over the wind. "Heave!" With a sickening groan of wood and earth, the timber beams slid into place, bracing the collapsing wall of the trench. The workmen scrambled to hammer in the stakes, their mallets echoing like gunshots in the night. When the structure was finally secure, Frederick collapsed back against the mud wall, gasping for air. Edith stood over him, her breath coming in ragged white plumes. They were both coated in gray silt, their faces unrecognizable, their hands raw. Frederick looked up at her, and suddenly, he began to laugh. It wasn't the bitter, hollow laugh from the roof. It was a dark, exhausted, human sound. "I suppose," he panted, wiping a streak of mud across his forehead. This wasn't in the architectural handbook. Edith reached down, offering him her hand. "The handbook assumes the client stays in bed, Your Grace." He took her hand. As he pulled himself up, his weight brought them close, chest to chest, their breath mingling in the cold air. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the touch of his hand on hers, the smell of wet earth, and the sudden, intense clarity in his eyes. He didn't let go immediately. He looked at her small, mud-stained hand, held within his own, and his thumb brushed against the blisters on her knuckles. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice suddenly quiet. "It's nothing," she whispered. "It isn't nothing," he countered. He let go, but the warmth of his grip lingered long after he turned to address the men. "Go to the kitchen. All of you. Tell the cook there's a bottle of my private whiskey in the pantry. Open it." As the men cheered and drifted away, Frederick turned back to Edith. He looked at the skeletal library, now safe behind its wooden braces. "You were right, Miss Penhaligon. It's a stubborn building. It wants to live. Perhaps," Edith said, her voice trembling slightly from the cold, "it just needed to know someone was willing to fight for it." The aftermath of the flood brought a strange, new equilibrium to the palace. The Duke no longer remained confined to his 3 rooms. He began to appear on the site at dawn, often with a pot of coffee and a set of eyes that missed no detail. He didn't command as a master, but as a partner in the struggle. One evening, as the first hints of spring began to soften the air, Edith found him in the south wing kitchen. He was sitting at the scarred wooden table, a single candle burning between them. He was cleaning the mud from a set of brass drawer pulls she had selected for the library. "The men tell me you're refusing your salary," he said, not looking up from his work. Edith paused in the doorway, a tray of tea in her hands. "I told you my price, Your Grace. 3 months. If I save the palace, the satisfaction is my payment. If I fail, I don't deserve a penny." "And your father's debts?" Frederick asked, his voice low. "I've made inquiries. He died with quite a few. Most of them to the guild." Edith felt a prickle of defensive pride. "I am managing them. By eating nothing but porridge and working 20 hours a day?" Frederick looked up. The firelight softened the harsh lines of his face. "Edith, you are the most capable person I have ever met. But even a foundation needs a rest from the weight." He stood up and walked toward her. The kitchen was small, and his presence seemed to fill every corner of it. He took the heavy tray from her hands and set it on the table. "I've had my solicitors settle with the guild," he said calmly. Edith's heart skipped. "You had no right." "I have every right to protect my chief architect," he interrupted, his voice firm but devoid of his former arrogance. "I don't want a martyr, Edith. I want a partner. This palace, it's changing. I see people coming here not to gawk at my wealth, but because they feel safe. The stonemasons bring their children for lunch. The carpenters sing while they work." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch the collar of her worn wool coat. "I haven't felt safe in a very long time. Not even before Gwendolyn left. I thought safety was something you bought with walls and titles, but it's not." Edith looked up at him, her pulse thrumming in her throat. "What is it then?" "It's a person," he whispered. "It's the way someone looks at a ruin and sees a home. It's the way you looked at me on that roof, even when I was trying to burn the world down." He didn't kiss her. He simply leaned his forehead against hers, a gesture of profound, quiet surrender. In the silence of the kitchen, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and the promise of a building reborn, Edith felt the last of the Duke's icy armor melt away. But the peace was a fragile thing. The next morning, a black carriage bearing a familiar, flamboyant crest rolled up the long, muddy drive. The gold leaf on its doors caught the sun, a jarring contrast to the honest stone of the palace. Lady Gwendolyn had returned. The carriage door opened with a sharp, rhythmic click that seemed to echo across the quiet valley. Lady Gwendolyn stepped out, her silk skirts a vibrant, jarring violet against the gray morning mist. She held a lace handkerchief to her nose, her eyes scanning the scaffolding and the piles of raw timber with profound distaste. "Good heavens, Frederick," she called out, her voice melodic and perfectly modulated, as if she were stepping into a ballroom rather than a construction site. "It looks like a quarry. Whatever have you been doing with my palace?" Edith stood on the portico, her hands instinctively clenching at her sides. She felt the dust on her skin and the fraying hem of her dress with sudden sharp clarity. Beside her, she felt Frederick stiffen. The warmth that had radiated from him only hours before in the kitchen vanished, replaced by a terrifying, stony stillness. Gwendolyn glided up the steps, ignoring Edith as if she were a piece of misplaced masonry. She stopped in front of Frederick, tilting her head with a practiced, feline grace. "I heard the news, darling. Your political fortunes have turned, and well, things didn't quite work out with the Count. I thought it was time I came home to oversee the finishing touches. Though I must say, these changes are quite rustic." Frederick didn't move. "You have no home here, Gwendolyn." She laughed, a silver sound that had no heart in it. "Don't be tedious. We both know the contracts were signed in my name as the future Duchess. And besides," she flicked a dismissive glance toward Edith, "I see you've been forced to employ cut-rate help. A woman architect? Really, Frederick? It's no wonder the place looks like a barn. You can dismiss the girl now. I've brought my own designer from the city." Edith felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck. It wasn't shame, it was the cold, hard realization of how people like Gwendolyn saw the world. To them, beauty was something bought and discarded, and people were merely tools to be used. "The girl is the lead architect of the Ashbourne estate," Frederick said. His voice was dangerously quiet, the low rumble of a storm just over the horizon. Gwendolyn stepped closer, reaching out to touch his lapel with a gloved hand. "Oh, Frederick, you were always so dramatic when you were hurt. But look at her. Look at this place. It's small. It's drab. It lacks the splendor I require. Now, let's go inside and discuss how we can fix this mess." She moved to brush past Edith, her shoulder intended to shove the other woman aside, but Frederick's hand shot out, catching Gwendolyn's wrist with a grip that made her gasp. "You speak of splendor," Frederick said, his voice echoing through the unfinished arches of the hall. "But you wouldn't know it if it stood before you. You see mud and stone. I see a foundation that didn't break when the world fell apart." He turned Gwendolyn around to face the building, the warm, sturdy south wing, the library with its deep wooden alcoves, the kitchen where the smoke of a real fire rose from the chimney. "You didn't build this, Gwendolyn. You didn't stay when the frost came. You didn't bleed for the stones when the trenches failed. You ran to the highest bidder. Frederick, you're hurting me," she hissed, her face contorting into a mask of indignation. "I am showing you the exit," he replied. He let go of her wrist and stepped back, moving to stand directly beside Edith. He didn't touch her, but the alignment of his body was an unmistakable shield. "The contracts you mentioned were tied to a marriage that will never happen. My solicitors have already filed the nullification based on your flight. This palace has a new name. It was recorded in the county scrolls yesterday." Gwendolyn narrowed her eyes. "What name?" Frederick looked at Edith. The hardness in his gaze softened into something luminous and profound. "It is no longer the White Moon Palace. It is Penhaligon Hall, named for the woman who understood that a house is only as strong as the heart of the person who designs it." Gwendolyn's face turned a mottled red. She looked at Edith, really looked at her, and saw not a servant, but a woman who held the Duke's respect in a way she never had. "You would choose this peasant? This mason's daughter? You will be the laughingstock of the capital." "Then I shall laugh with them," Frederick said. "Now, get in your carriage. If you are still on my lands in 10 minutes, I will have the stonemasons escort you to the border. And believe me, they have very little patience for silk." Gwendolyn didn't wait. She turned, her heels clicking furiously against the stone, and practically fled down the steps. The carriage door slammed, the horses were whipped into a lather, and within moments, the violet silk was gone, swallowed by the mist of the moors. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the scent of damp earth and the distant sound of a hammer hitting a nail. Edith felt as though she were floating, the world around her shifting into a new, terrifyingly beautiful shape. "Penhaligon Hall?" she whispered, looking up at the massive stone lintel above the door. "It was the only name that fit," Frederick said. He turned to her, his expression vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "I told you I wanted a partner, Edith. I didn't just mean for the construction." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a gold key, newly cast, its bow shaped like a compass rose. He took her hand, the hand with the scars and the graphite stains, and pressed the key into her palm. "The final stone was laid this morning," he said. "The library is finished, the fire is lit, but the house won't truly be a home until you decide to stay in it." Edith looked at the key, then at the man who had walked through the fire with her. She saw the soldier who had learned to be gentle, the duke who had learned to be a man, and the soul that had found its rest in her work. "I've spent my life building walls for other people," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I think I'd like to live inside these." Frederick smiled, a real warm smile that reached his eyes. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw before tilting her face up to his. "Then let's go home, Edith." The evening was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes when a great task is finally complete. Inside Penhaligon Hall, the air was warm, smelling of cedarwood and the faint, sweet scent of the first spring jasmine. In the library, the fire crackled softly in the granite hearth. Frederick sat in the high-backed oak chair, a book open on his lap, but his eyes weren't on the pages. He was watching Edith. She was standing by the large bay window she had designed, her silhouette framed by the falling snow outside. She was sketching not a palace this time, but a small cottage, something simple and sturdy for the head stonemason's family. The Duke stood up and walked over to her, sliding his arms around her waist from behind. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his warmth seeping through her wool dress. "You never stop, do you?" he murmured into her hair. "There is always something more to build, Frederick," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "Yes," he agreed, his grip tightening slightly, a gesture of quiet, protective love. "But for tonight, the sky is held up, the walls are strong, and the fire is high." Edith set down her charcoal and turned in his arms, resting her hands on his shoulders. The flickering light of the hearth danced in her eyes that no longer looked for ruins, but saw only the long, beautiful horizon of a life shared. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the moors in a soft, white silence. But inside the hall that bore her name, there was only the sound of two hearts beating in time, and the quiet, steady glow of a hope that had finally found its place to rest.